6. Double crossfire. Late that afternoon, Colonel Jack Jones phoned for his driver to pick him up outside Zak's apartment building. The young special agent had been thoughtful and bad company after the phone call. Both Jed Gray and the colonel were used to Zak's ways, one of which was to settle back after such a happening, to reconsider all that had gone before. They knew that Zak's pattern of thinking rarely matched up with theirs and that he was, almost always, in the right. Part of Zak Biko's success was his ability to put himself into the criminal's shoes. He never believed what men told him, or women either. He worked things out for himself. That way he got his crook, male or female. The time wore on and Zak Biko still sat in his favorite armchair. Jed Gray went about his normal business in the flat. The junkie, Jamie Hall, was still in his cell and could not be heard beyond the four walls surrounding his temporary retreat. At last, Zak raised his head and called softly, "Jed." The man appeared in a second. "Sir." "Jed. We're being watched by several pairs of eyes. We'll leave by the way they can't see." Both men grinned. The building in which Zak had his flat backed onto another identical one. They were both part of a square of similar luxury blocks which faced the park. One of the apartments in the block behind was owned by Zak Biko, but, to the outside world and to the janitor, it belonged to an old lady who traveled a lot. Right now, Mrs. Jennifer Baxter was in Europe. Colonel Jack Jones knew of Zak's double dwelling place. He had supplied one of his own trained female agents from time to time to become Mrs. Baxter and live openly in the flat. Zak kept a second car in the basement garage there. It was a dark blue sedan which was kept serviced and filled with gas for just such an occasion. Both men had changed and now wore dark casual clothing with black roll-neck sweaters. In the darkness, with their black skins, neither need worry about being seen. They went together to collect Jamie Hall. The man was sweating and getting into a bad state, but Biko had little sympathy to waste on him. They hauled him to his feet, gagged him and pushed his head into a small sack. Zak Biko lifted him over his shoulder, sending Jed on ahead to see if the covered way was clear. By now the light had gone and the inner courtyard and passageway were little used after dark anyway. They got to the opposite flat without meeting anyone. 20 minutes later the blue sedan nosed its way silently out into the main traffic stream. In the car not a word passed between Jed and Zak Biko. The little drug addict lay bound and motionless on the back seat, but the two men were far too experienced to underestimate a man suffering not only from lack of drugs but also from fright. They were determined that if he should live to be reunited with his unsavory employers, Jamie Hall would have little to add to their store of evil knowledge. The journey out of the city took some time. Most of the oncoming traffic was making for the theaters, clubs, and cinemas. Once beyond the city limits the car gathered speed until, some distance before the boundary of the Harvey estate was reached, Zak Biko turned the car into a side lane. With lights dimmed, they moved ever closer to their journey's end. On the back seat, Jamie Hall had begun to moan a little, but the two men in front paid no attention. Jed Gray stole many glances at his thoughtful chief. Jed knew Zak Biko better than any man alive and he knew that he was busy trying to get into the minds of the black gang. Zak slowed the powerful car to a crawl. Ahead and all around them, trees cast moving shadows eerily over everything. The minutes dragged by. Zak reached for a cigarette and, without a word, offered one to Jed. In silence they enjoyed their smokes, each man wondering if it would be their last. Then Zak tapped Jed's knee. The car slid to a halt and for a while they sat watching as the cold wind moved branches and bushes around with weird and wonderful ease. At a prearranged signal, Jed climbed in beside the bound and gagged Jamie. He tested the ropes, then hauled the little man out onto the turf. Zak unfastened the big boot. Together they laid Hall inside and locked it. Then they set out. Soon they were approaching the muddy area outside the low wall skirting the end of the lawn at the back of the Harvey residence. Like ghosts they slipped across the wall and into the trees around the lawn itself. They came to a halt some 50 yards from the glass doors leading into the room that had been Franklin Harvey's study. No lights showed in any of the main rooms, but a room to the left of the kitchen was not only lighted but occupied as well. The watchers saw the shadow of a woman moving across the blind and then that of a man. Evidently Sid Kendall had followed his wife into the kitchen because the lights of that room also went on. "Looks normal enough." Jed's words hissed into Zak's ear. "Nothing's normal." Zak looked sour. "Do you think they're in it?" Zak nodded into the darkness. "The Kendalls?" "I'm not 100% sure, but I reckon so." "Work on those lines anyway, Jed. It's safer. It seems that those Kendalls are laid out of bed, if they're not expecting visitors." Jed's murmur held a note of urgency. "Maybe it's as well to watch our step from here on." He glanced back the way they'd come. "Don't look back, Jed." Zak moved cat-like towards another tree closer to the house. "I'm going to tap on that lighted window. Cover me." As Zak approached the innocent-looking window behind which both Kendalls were showing their restlessness to anyone interested enough to be watching from the garden, he felt the blood pump harder through his veins. He tapped lightly 3 times. It was Janet Kendall who peered around the curtains, but Zak knew she wouldn't be able to see out. He, however, could see in, and behind her he saw the figure of her husband. Sid Kendall was staring out like a man scared to death. Then Janet pushed the window upwards a little. "Who is it?" Janet's voice was low and full of fear. "Zak Biko, Janet. Open the back door." She made no answer, but closed the window and pulled the curtains across. Zak eased over to the back entrance and waited. No more lights appeared, but, after a reasonable wait, he heard the bolts being drawn back, and for the second time in 48 hours he prepared to enter the house of Franklin Harvey, the murdered millionaire. What Jed did from now on would be up to him. The 2 men had been in this position many times before, the one inside facing the unknown, the other outside and alone with his fears for the life of his chief. "Where's Miss Harvey?" Janet sniffed. "You tell me, Mr. Biko. You're supposed to be the expert on crime." Zak shrugged. "Maybe I will at that." "Sit about." "He's in our room." "Why?" Zak followed the housekeeper down the short narrow passage connecting the kitchen to the staff sitting room. "It's 11:30. You folks certainly keep late hours. Is there any particular reason?" They entered the room almost on top of one another. Once inside, Zak elbowed the door shut and stood against it, his hand never far from his gun pocket. Sid Kendall scowled at him. "Murder and kidnapping, Biko, and that kid burglar getting shot. How do you expect me and Sid to sleep nights?" Janet's glare matched her husband's sour look. Zak took his time before answering. "Miss Harvey is to be returned to this house by her kidnappers, at midnight if they keep their word." That was the moment when he became convinced that the Kendalls knew exactly what had been planned. They did their best to look astonished and pleased in that order, but it didn't quite come off, and Zak Biko was good at reading expressions. Regarding the injured boy, Zak remained in his position with his back against the heavy oaken door. "Have either of you ever seen him before?" Sid and Janet shook their heads, then Sid said, "Why should we? Mr. Franklin never encouraged hawkers or traders inside the grounds." "The boy might die before morning," said Zak sharply. "I don't think he was here hawking, and neither do you, Sid. All the same, if he dies, I'll be holding the pair of you as accessories after murder." The effect of his words on the Kendalls was electric. By now Sid's mouth was opening and closing and his eyes were widening like a king-sized fish. His breathing sounded harsh, and, for a moment, he seemed likely to pass out. But Janet was made of sterner stuff. "If we knew anything that might help, we'd say so, mister. Me and Sid are only the hired help. We worked for Mr. Franklin and I'm fond of Miss Linda. Is there any harm in that?" Zak smiled. "None that I can think of." His hand found the key in the lock behind him. He turned it, then slid towards the window. Janet. When I give the word, switch off the light. And, just in case you're not on the level, my gun is pointing at Sid's fat stomach. You're crazy. We're not involved, I tell you. Janet nudged the still paralyzed Sid. Sit down, you old fool. 8. Let's have it dark in here. The light went out. Zak pushed the window up and gave a low whistle. Seconds later, Jed Grey was inside. At a word from Zak, Janet Kendall put the light back on after Zak himself had drawn the heavy curtains across the glass panes. Keeping his voice down so that anyone listening from outside the house could not possibly hear, Zak said, Jed. Keep these two quiet. Use whatever method becomes necessary. They are not to raise a squeak. Jed Grey moved across the room, nodding to show his acceptance of the orders. When I'm out, relock that door and shoot the bolts. There are two you'll notice. Top and bottom. One wonders why. Janet answered the question. Mr. Franklin used to tell us when we were alone in this great house that, if we should hear intruders, we were to keep to our own rooms. There wasn't much we could have done to stop gangsters robbing the place, anyway. That's the reason for the bolt stud. It's the same in our bedroom. Zak didn't bother to reply. Instead, he left them like a shadow. The whole operation had only taken seconds, and now he was really alone against the most powerful gang ever known. The house was pitch black inside, and the heavy carpets underfoot served to deaden any sound made either by him or by the ungodly. At any moment he expected to feel the impact of a bullet in his back, but nothing stirred. He moved against the walls towards the front hall, which, as he recalled, was as big as many a normal dwelling. The noise, when it came, was as if someone wanted to cry out but couldn't, and it came from the direction of the downstairs study that had belonged to the dead Franklin Harvey. Zak froze where he was. The fun was about to start. The noise was intended to lure him to his death, of that, he was sure. Seconds later, from a point above him, a thug halfway up the stairs blazed out with a gun. Zak felt the breeze made by the bullet and dropped flat, his own gun at the ready. He was too old a hand to give away his position that easily. That the place was lousy with gunmen, Zak was certain, but at least he did know it. A grandfather clock in the hall started to chime at midnight. One of Zak Biko's many abilities was that he could see better than a cat in the dark. Making no sound, he eased away on his stomach to the area beside the rising staircase. It was already occupied, but the cutthroat standing there ceased to take any further interest in what was happening when the lithe form rose up out of nowhere and Zak's two hands enclosed his windpipe in a vice-like grip of steel. Gently the detective lowered the man's body to the carpet, right where anyone coming that way would fall over it. Then he took the thug's place. From the stairs a gun spoke again. This time Zak's weapon answered it, and a yell from above was reward enough. Once more, Zak Biko took aim, squeezing his trigger gently. The second yell was followed by the sound of a heavy body bumping down the stairs. There had been two thugs on duty on that landing. Now the way was clear for Zak. Zak made the landing, standing politely aside to allow free passage as the second body passed him on its way to the hall below. But the noise had been heard and the hall lights were suddenly turned on. By that time, Zak was in position. He had remembered the alcove there and knew he could cover a wide area from this vantage point. From the study door a man shouted, "Show yourself, Biko." Zak remained silent. The man tried again. "Okay. Have it your way, one shot from your gun and Linda Harvey dies. We've got her here in her uncle's study. She's tied up and gagged. You shoot and so do we. Answer me, Biko." Zak grinned but kept silent. Meanwhile, inside the study, there were scuffling movements, then a man started to step into the hall. Zak's gun barked once, the man screamed once, then began to pull himself across the lintel like a wounded crab. The gang boss had his answer. "Say your prayers, Biko. He dies and you do." Zak recognized the voice as belonging to the man who had telephoned him earlier on at his apartment in New York. It sounded angry, he was snarling like a wounded leopard. Upstairs on the landing, Zak wasn't feeling so good either. He could be wrong in his ideas, they might kill the girl. One quick glance down into the hall showed another figure creeping from the sitting room. This room had been kept strictly for entertaining and had wide double panels which now stood open. Zak allowed the man to come a little closer, then fired. The man died before he hit the carpet. Zak felt better and nobody else attempted to show themselves. They tried another tack. Suddenly the Harvey house echoed to the sound of automatic weapons, but only in short bursts. Zak Biko recognized the move as one of intimidation. There followed an oppressive silence. Throughout the entire operation, down on his knees in the brick alcove, Zak had watched where the bullets had come from. Now he shifted upstairs to the gallery. From here, anyone moving down below was a target he couldn't miss. Back inside the Kendalls' sitting room, Jed Gray heard the shooting and grew chilled with fear for his chief. Moving decisively, he ripped the cloth away from the table, throwing it at Janet. He hissed instructions to tear it into strips. Thoroughly scared now, Janet did as Jed told her. She jibbed a little when he forced her to bind and gag her own husband and struggled madly when he performed the same service for her. Jed had had his instructions to stay right here with these folk, but he was only human. To stay on guard while Zak Biko got murdered wasn't written into Jed's book of rules. Soon both Kendalls were trussed like Christmas turkeys and Jed had locked their door behind him, not forgetting to take the key. Then he, too, moved towards the main part of the house. This was divided from the servants' quarters by a heavy, green cloth-covered swing door that made no sound when pushed. Jed opened it silently. From where he stood, Jed Gray could just make out the figure of a man standing inside the study. He couldn't see enough of him to identify him, but he could see the hairy hand holding a big revolver. Jed watched as the revolver swung upwards and knew that his chief was somewhere up above. He took aim and fired. The hand disappeared and an unearthly scream ripped across and through the echoing house. In the silence that followed, broken only by the moans and cries of the man who had lost not only his gun but part of his hand, Zak heard several cars roaring up the Harvey Drive. He didn't need the shouts of "Police! Open up!" to tell him that Colonel Jack Jones had kept his promise not to be too far away. Zak ran downstairs, meeting Jed at the bottom. Jerking his head, he said, "Let them in." He ran for the study, calling back as he ran, "Thanks, Jed." The study was in worse shape than the original intruder had left it. On the floor, the man shot by Jed Gray was bleeding his life out and begging for help. In one of Franklin Harvey's deep leather armchairs, Linda Harvey lay bound and gagged in a dead faint. The glass doors stood open to the bitter night. The gang had vanished, leaving 3 dead men and 1 badly shot up to tell of their passing. An hour passed swiftly. The Kendalls were released and told to get busy seeing after Linda. The girl was put to bed by Janet and Dr. Allard was called in to see to the injured gunman, but he hadn't much chance for he had lost too much blood. Finally, the ambulance came to fetch the bodies and to take the gunman to hospital where every effort would be made to save him for questioning later. Colonel Jack Jones was in a towering rage. "We could have got this gang of thieves and robbers if you'd let us get in earlier on." Jack Jones felt like murdering his ace detective, but Zak smiled knowingly. "Cool it, Jack. We've gone a long way with this case, further than you think. What's the news about the boy?" "Still in a coma." Colonel Jack Jones swallowed his pride. "Why?" "They've threatened not to let him live. His well-being is in your hands, Jack." "How many guards are with him?" 2 in the room and 2 outside it. I've also arranged for a special car in the nursing home drive. It's fitted with 2-way radio and has 4 guys on watch. I'm going there now, Jack." Zak Biko grinned at his boss and friend. "Keep faith, man. I've got ideas I shouldn't have." Jack Jones interrupted him. "What about the girl?" Doc Allard's with her now. Her story had better be good. Nobody cut off her finger, is that what you mean? That's exactly what I mean. The thugs probably threatened to amputate if she didn't put up a realistic show. It was realistic. Something scared her half to death. Jack Jones looked thoughtful. He put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. Go to it, boy. But don't get in deeper than you can manage. By the way, where's Jamie Hull? Did you bring him here? Still trussed up in the boot of my car, I guess. We thought he'd get in the way, so we left him there. By now he's probably half mad and in need of medical attention. He's a drug addict. You'll see to it. Jed here'll go back for the car. Not alone, he won't. Colonel Jack Jones put his foot down. There are enough bodies around here for one night. He shouted for a driver. 10 minutes later, Jed Gray and two of the regular police opened the car boot in which Jamie Hall had been put away, but it was empty. The cords and gag lay in a heap on the grass, and the junkie had returned to his friends. Much good might it do him, Jed Gray said to Zak when they got back to the Harvey place with the news. Zak led the way out. Come on, Jed, one more job before we go home. We've got to go sick visiting. I have a feeling that boy I found is more important than we know.